Pain arrived before consciousness, a tingling sensation that rose up her legs, crossed her hips, and exploded at the base of her skull like glass being ground. She tried to open her eyes, but her eyelids felt as heavy as lead. The smell was of wet earth, decomposing leaves, and something metallic that made her stomach turn. When she finally managed to focus her vision, the sky was leaden, filled with low clouds that promised more rain. She was lying on the rough asphalt of a secondary road, surrounded by dense woods on both sides. The tall, closed vegetation created a kind of green tunnel where daylight arrived filtered and shadowy. On the horizon, the taillights of a car disappeared like two red stars being swallowed by the mist. She tried to move, but every muscle protested. Her blouse was torn at the shoulder, stained with something dark that she preferred not to identify. Her hair, once loose, was now stuck to her forehead with dried blood. She brought a trembling hand to her temple and felt a superficial cut already coagulated. But it was when she tried to remember how she had gotten there that true terror invaded her. There was nothing. No name, no familiar face, not a single memory that could serve as an anchor. It was as if her mind were a completely dark room where someone had purposely broken all the lights. The sound of tires on the road made her raise her head with effort. A black Mercedes approached slowly, almost cautiously. The car stopped a few meters from her, and for long seconds, no one got out. She could see a male silhouette through the windshield, but his features were indistinct. When the door opened, the first thing she noticed were the shoes. Expensive Italian leather, completely inappropriate for a dirt road. Then the legs, covered by impeccable dress pants. When she finally dared to look at the man's face, she felt something strange in her chest, like recognition without memory, and familiarity she couldn't explain. He was tall, probably in his 40s, with dark hair combed back and a stubble that gave him a wild look, despite his refined clothes. But it was the eyes that paralyzed her, green as the forest surrounding them, and with an intensity that seemed to pierce her soul and read secrets she herself didn't know. "You're safe now," he said, and his voice had a soft southern accent, but there was something more, an absolute certainty, as if those words had already been spoken before, many times. He knelt beside her with controlled movements, like someone approaching an injured animal. His hands were large, with long fingers, and when they touched her face to examine the wound, she felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold afternoon. "You don't remember me, do you?" he asked, but he didn't seem surprised. There was a resignation in his expression that suggested he had already expected that answer. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry as sandpaper. He seemed to understand and went to the car to get a bottle of water. He helped her sit up against his legs and held the bottle while she took small sips. The liquid went down burning but brought immediate relief. Who are you?" she finally managed to murmur. "Richard," he answered simply. "Richard Devereux, and you need to come with me." It wasn't a question, it was a statement, said with the naturalness of someone who had already made the decision for her. He helped her to her feet, supporting her weight when her legs failed. He was stronger than he looked, and she found herself being carried in his arms to the back seat of the car with an ease that frightened her. The interior of the Mercedes smelled of expensive leather and a masculine cologne that did something strange to her stomach. Not nausea, but a kind of bodily recognition that her conscious mind couldn't process. He adjusted the air conditioning and covered her with a coat that was on the front seat. "Where are we going?" she asked, watching. The familiar but nameless landscape passed by the window. "Home," he replied, looking at her in the rearview mirror. "To my home. You'll stay with me until you recover." The road began to climb through hills covered with pine trees and cattle ranches. They passed a sign that said Goldfield, 15 miles, but the name didn't awaken any memory. After a few more Miles, Richard turned onto a private road, narrow and surrounded by high walls covered with ivy. The property extended for acres. She could see horses grazing in green fields, an old chapel on top of a hill, and finally, like an apparition from a dream, the mansion. It was an imposing colonial construction, 3 stories high, with wide verandas supported by stone columns. The windows were tall and narrow, protected by dark wooden shutters. Formal gardens spread out in front of the house, with stone fountains and rose bushes that seemed decades old. But there was something in the architecture that suggested secrets. Many blind windows, night towers that didn't seem to have a practical function, and an entire wing of the house where the windows were completely closed. "It's beautiful," she murmured, and Richard smiled for the first time. "It's been in the family for generations," he said. "My great-grandfather built it when he made his fortune in the gold mines of the region. These days, I have other businesses, but this has always been my real home." He stopped the car in front of the main entrance where a middle-aged woman waited for them. She had dark hair with gray streaks tied in a bun, wearing a simple but impeccable uniform. "This is Mrs. Connie," Richard introduced. "She takes care of the house. Connie, this is our guest. She'll be staying in the blue room." The woman nodded with a warm smile, but there was something in her eyes that didn't match the expression, a kind of pity, or perhaps concern. "Welcome, dear," she said. "I'll prepare a hot bath and something to eat." Richard carried her up the stairs, through the wide corridors decorated with old paintings and period furniture. The walls were covered with faded floral wallpaper, and Persian rugs covered the dark wooden floor that creaked under their feet. There were family portraits everywhere, men with mustaches and women in long dresses, all with the same intense green eyes as Richard. The blue room was on the 2nd floor, overlooking the gardens. It was elegant but cozy, with a double bed, covered by a light blue silk comforter, antique armchairs arranged near the fireplace, and a mahogany dressing table where someone had placed fresh flowers. "Rest," said Richard, gently placing her on the bed. "Tomorrow I'll call a doctor to examine you. Don't worry about anything now." But when he turned to leave, she felt an inexplicable urgency. "Richard," she called, and he stopped immediately. "How did you know where to find me?" He stood still for long seconds, with his back to her. When he finally turned, there was a shadow in his eyes that wasn't there before. "I drive by that road every day," he finally said. "Lucky for you." But there was something in the way he avoided her gaze that suggested luck had nothing to do with it. After he left, she was alone in the silence of the mansion. She could hear the wind shaking the trees outside, the distant sound of footsteps in the corridors, and occasionally a door closing somewhere in the house. But there was another sound too, classical music coming from some room downstairs. Piano and violin, melancholy and familiar. Mrs. Connie brought a tray with soup, homemade bread and tea. She sat in the armchair while she ate, talking about the weather, about the flowers in the garden, about anything that wasn't the obvious questions. "Hanging in the air. How long have you known Richard?" she finally asked. "I've worked for the Devereux family for 20 years, Mrs. Connie answered. "I saw the boy grow up, become a man. He's a good person, my lady, has a broken heart, but he's a good person." Broken heart? Mrs. Connie hesitated, looking at the door as if fearing that someone might be listening. "He lost his fiancée a few years ago, a tragedy. Since then, he's never been the same." "What happened?" "Accident," Mrs. Connie said quickly, but again there was something in her expression that didn't match her words. "I don't like to talk about it. Brings bad luck." After dinner, she took a hot bath in the antique bronze-footed tub. The water was perfumed with salts that smelled of lavender and rosemary. and for the first time since she had woken up on the road, she felt her muscles relax. But when she closed her eyes, strange fragments began to appear. Masculine hands touching her face, loud music, flashing lights. Nothing concrete, just sensations that made her heart race for no apparent reason. She put on the silk nightgown that someone had left on the bed, light blue, exactly her size, and lay down between the soft sheets. Outside, night had fully arrived, and the only light came from the full moon entering through the tall windows. That's when she heard the footsteps in the corridor. Slow, measured, stopping in front of her door. For long minutes there was no more sound, and she wondered if she had imagined it all. But then the doorknob moved slowly, and the door opened just a crack. "Are you asleep?" asked Richard's voice. "In the dark." "No," she answered, sitting up in bed. He entered the room without turning on the light, just a silhouette against the illuminated corridor. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans, completely different from the elegant man who had rescued her. There was something wilder about him now, more dangerous. "How are you feeling?" he asked, approaching the bed. "Confused," she admitted. "Scared. I can't remember anything, Richard. It's like I didn't exist before today." He sat on the edge of the bed and the mattress gave under his weight. "Maybe it's better that way," he said softly. "Sometimes forgetting is a blessing." "You speak as if you know." "I do," he answered, and there was a pain in his voice that made her shudder. "There are things I wish I could forget." They remained silent, observing each other in the half-light. There was a tension in the air that she couldn't identify, not discomfort, but something more primitive, as if their bodies recognized each other, even if their minds didn't. "May I stay?" he asked finally. "Just until you fall asleep. I don't want you to feel alone." She should have said no. She should have questioned why a man who claimed to be a stranger wanted to sleep in her room. But there was something in the way he made the request, almost vulnerable, as if it were he who needed company. "You may," she said, sliding to the side of the bed. Richard lay down on top of the covers, maintaining a respectful distance. But she could feel the heat of his body, the smell of his cologne, the sound of his breathing. It was comforting and disturbing at the same time. "Richard," she murmured in the dark, "I have the feeling we've met before." He remained quiet for so long that she thought perhaps he had fallen asleep. But then she felt the bed move slightly when he turned on his side to look at her. "Sleep," he said softly, and his voice carried a gentle authority that made her eyelids heavy. "Tomorrow we'll start again." But as she slipped into sleep, she heard him whisper something that made her heart race. "Welcome back, my dear." And for the first time since she had woken up on the road, she wondered if Richard Devereux was her salvation or her damnation. She woke with the sun coming through the blinds, creating golden stripes on the wooden floor. For a moment she was disoriented, not knowing where she was. Then the memories of the previous day returned like a wave. The road, Richard, the mysterious mansion. She sat up in bed and checked her body. The pains had diminished considerably, and the cut on her temple was healing well. From outside, she could hear the sound of horses neighing and footsteps in the courtyard. Life on the property had already begun. She got up and went to the window, pushing aside the lace curtains to better observe the gardens. It was even more impressive in daylight. Old rose bushes climbing the walls, a perfectly trimmed boxwood maze, and beyond that, green fields that extended as far as the eye could see. There were new clothes waiting for her in the wardrobe, simple but elegant dresses, all exactly her size. How did Richard know her measurements? She chose a light blue cotton dress and went downstairs, following the aroma of coffee and fresh bread. The kitchen was enormous, with a wood-burning stove, copper utensils hanging on the walls, and a solid, wooden table in the center, Mrs. Connie was preparing breakfast, humming an old song. When she saw her enter, she smiled warmly. "Did you sleep well, dear? Mr. Richard has already left to take care of some business, but he said he'd be back for lunch." "What kind of business does he have?" she asked, sitting at the table. Mrs. Connie served coffee with milk in a fine porcelain cup and placed in front of her a plate with homemade bread, red berry jam, and local cheese. "A bit of everything," she answered vaguely. "Mining, agribusiness, some companies in the capital. The Devereux family has always been very prosperous." "And his family? Are his parents alive?" Mrs. Connie's expression darkened slightly. "His father died 10 years ago in a car accident. His mother, well, she's in a clinic in Horizon City. Mental problems. Richard visits her every month, but..." She paused, as if she had said more than she should. "Mental problems?" "Mrs. Eleanor was always a fragile woman," said Mrs. Connie, lowering her voice. "After she lost her husband, she began to have episodes. Said she saw things, heard voices. The doctors say it's schizophrenia, but..." She shook her head. "Sometimes I think she simply knows too much." Before she could ask what that meant, Mrs. Connie abruptly changed the subject. "Why don't you take a walk around the house? It's beautiful, and it will help you feel more at home." After breakfast, she decided to explore the mansion. She started with the ground floor, formal living rooms with antique furniture, an impressive library with shelves that went from floor to ceiling, a masculine office with the smell of leather and tobacco. Each room told a story of the wealth and tradition of the Devereux family. But it was when she went up to the second floor that she began to notice strange details. There were paintings everywhere, landscapes, family portraits, still lifes. But in many of them, there were empty spaces on the walls, as if other canvases had been removed recently. Lighter, square marks on the wallpaper betrayed where other works had once hung. At the end of the corridor, there was a door different from the others, heavier with an old and ornate lock. When she tried to open it, she discovered it was locked. But there was something familiar about that door, as if she had already tried to open it before. "That room is closed for renovations," said a voice behind her. She turned, startled. Richard was standing a few meters away, still wearing a dark suit, but with his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up. There was mud on the soles of his shoes, as if he had been walking around the property. "You came back early," she said, trying to hide her nervousness. "The business was quicker than expected," he answered, approaching. "How are you feeling?" "Better. Mrs. Connie took good care of me." He nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the locked door. "Let's go down. I'd like to show you the gardens." It wasn't a question, and she noticed that Richard had a habit of directing situations without giving much room for objections. They went down together, and he took her outside through a door that led to the rear gardens. The property was even bigger than she had imagined. Beyond the formal gardens, there were orchards, a vegetable garden, stables with purebred horses, and an artificial lake with swans. Richard walked beside her, pointing out details of the landscape, but she noticed that he was constantly observing her, as if measuring her reactions. "It's very peaceful here," she commented. "Don't you miss the city?" "I've lived enough time in cities," he answered. "Here I can think, work in peace, and..." He paused. "Here I can protect what's important to me." The way he said this sent a shiver down her spine. There was an intensity in his voice that suggested he wasn't just talking about the property. They stopped near the lake, sitting on a stone bench under the shade of a willow. The swans glided gracefully over the water, and the sound of their breathing mingled with the soft noise of leaves swaying in the wind. "Richard," she said finally, "I need to ask you something." and I want you to be honest with me." He turned to face her, and she was momentarily lost in the intensity of those green eyes. "You can ask me anything. How did you know exactly where to find me yesterday? That road was deserted. There was no reason for you to be passing by at that time." Richard remained quiet for long seconds, watching the swans on the lake. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, almost intimate. "I have nightmares," he said, "for years. Always the same dream, an injured woman on a road needing help. Yesterday morning, the dream was so real that I couldn't concentrate on anything else. I got in the car and drove out, with no specific direction. When I saw that secondary road, something made me turn onto it." "You're saying you found me because of a dream?" "I know how it sounds," he said, finally looking at her. "But I believe some people are destined to meet, no matter how many times they get lost along the way." There was something in the way he said "how many times" that made her shudder, as if they had already been lost and found each other before. "And if I never recover my memory?" she asked. "And if I never know who I really am?" Richard extended his hand and touched her face with a gentleness that contrasted with the strength she knew he possessed. "Then you'll be whoever you choose to be from now on. The past doesn't always need to define us." But there was something in his eyes that contradicted his words, as if the past was exactly what defined them. They returned to the house in the middle of the afternoon, and Richard locked himself in his office to take phone calls. She took the opportunity to continue exploring the mansion. On the first floor, she discovered a music room with a gleaming black grand piano. The keys were clean, as if they were regularly played. When she tried a few notes, she discovered she knew how to play. Her hands moved automatically over the keys, performing a melancholy melody that she recognized but couldn't identify. "Chopin," said Richard from the door. "Nocturne in E-flat major. It was always one of your favorites." She immediately stopped playing. "One of my favorites? How can you know that if we only met yesterday?" Richard entered the room, closing the door behind him. He had removed his jacket and tie, and the first buttons of his shirt were open, revealing a piece of his chest covered with dark hair. There was something different in his posture now, less controlled, wilder. "Because some things transcend memory," he said, approaching the piano. "The body remembers what the mind forgets." He sat next to her on the bench, and his fingers began to play the continuation of the melody she had started. His hands moved with surprising elegance for someone of his size, and the music that came from the piano was full of passion and melancholy. "I learned to play to impress a woman," he said, without stopping playing. "I spent months practicing this specific piece because I knew she loved it, and did it. Work?" He stopped playing and turned to her. They were so close that she could feel his breath on her face, see the small scars that marked his hands. "For a while," he said softly, but then she disappeared. "What happened to her?" "That's what I'm trying to find out," he answered, and there was a pain in his voice that made her want to console him. Without thinking, she extended her hand and touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw with her fingers. He closed his eyes at her touch, as if savoring the sensation. "Richard," she murmured. When he opened his eyes, there was a hunger in them that made her tremble. He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. But she didn't want to. When his lips touched hers, it was as if a flame had been lit in her chest. The kiss began gently, exploratory, but quickly intensified. His hands rose to her hair, pulling her closer, and she heard herself moaning against his mouth. There was an urgency in that kiss, as if they were trying to recover something lost through physical contact. When they finally separated, both were Breathing heavily, Richard rested his forehead on hers, and his hands were still trembling slightly when they touched her face. "I'm sorry," he said. "I shouldn't have—" "Don't apologize," she interrupted. "I wanted it too." They stayed like that for long minutes, breathing the same air, looking into each other's eyes. There was a connection between them that went beyond physical attraction, something deep and primitive that neither she nor he could explain. "Are you hungry?" he asked, finally, trying to return to normality. "A little." Mrs. Connie prepared a special dinner. "Shall we?" During dinner, Richard made an effort to keep the conversation light. He talked about the history of the region, about the horses, about the family businesses, but she noticed that he was constantly observing her, as if memorizing every expression, every gesture. "Tomorrow I'll call Dr. Morgan to examine you," he said when they finished eating. "He's discreet and very competent. Perhaps he can help with the memory loss. And if he wants to take me to a hospital, do more complex tests?" "That won't happen," said Richard with a certainty that surprised her. "You'll stay here with me until you're completely recovered." Again, it wasn't a question. It was a statement said as if he had authority over her. And as much as it should bother her, she found herself feeling protected by his certainty. After dinner, he accompanied her to her room. He stopped at the door, clearly struggling with himself. "May I come in?" he asked, echoing the question. "From the night before?" "You may," she answered without hesitation. This time, he lay down closer, and she could feel the heat of his body through his thin shirt. They lay talking in the dark about unimportant things, the stars visible through the window, the nighttime sounds of the farm, the music they had played together. "Richard," she said when silence settled between them, "I feel as if I'm waiting for something, as if there's something important I need to remember, but I can't." "Maybe it's better not to force it," he said, and his voice sounded strange in the dark. "Sometimes when we force a memory too much, it hides deeper." "You speak like someone who has experience with this." "I do," he admitted. "There are things from my past that I also prefer not to remember." She turned on her side to look at him, though she could barely distinguish his features in the darkness. "The woman who disappeared," she said. "Was she the one you loved?" Richard remained quiet, for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was loaded with emotion. "Yes," he said simply, "it was her." "And you think that I could be her?" Another long silence. Then he moved on the bed, coming closer until she could feel his breath on her neck. "I think," he said softly, "that you are exactly who you should be." He kissed her again, this time with more passion, more desperation. His hands explored her body over the nightgown, and she found herself responding with a hunger she didn't know she possessed. When his fingers touched her bare skin, she moaned and arched against him. "Are you sure?" he asked, pausing for a moment. In response, she pulled his head down and kissed him forcefully. There were no doubts in her mind. Her body knew what it wanted, even if her mind was lost. What happened next was an explosion of sensations. His hands seemed to know exactly where to touch her, how to move her, how to make her tremble with pleasure. It was as if their bodies were finely tuned instruments playing a song they already knew by heart. When they finally reached their climax together, she cried out his name, and he whispered hers in her ear like a prayer. They remained entwined afterward, breathing heavily, covered in sweat and completely satisfied. "How is it possible?" she murmured against his chest. "How can we fit together so perfectly if we've only known each other for 2 days?" Richard caressed her hair, but didn't answer immediately. When he finally spoke, There was a note of sadness in his voice. "Some souls recognize each other," he said, "no matter how many times they get lost." She fell asleep in his arms, more complete than she remembered feeling. But during the night, she had strange dreams, fragments of memories that she couldn't place in time, loud music, flashing lights, a sense of danger, and always Richard's voice saying, "You're safe now." But in the dreams, he didn't seem to be trying to comfort her. He seemed to be trying to convince her. When she woke in the morning, Richard was no longer in bed. She got up and put on a robe, deciding to look for him. But when she passed through the corridor on the second floor, she noticed something strange. The door that had been locked the day before was now ajar. Her heart accelerated. She should go back to the room, wait for Richard, not intrude in places where she hadn't been invited. But something stronger pulled her toward that door. She pushed. It opened slowly and entered. It was a studio, easels, paints, brushes, canvases in various stages of completion, but they weren't landscapes or still lifes. They were all portraits of women, dozens of them. And when her eyes adjusted to the filtered light that entered through the windows, she noticed something that made her blood freeze. All the women had her face. There were variations, different ages, different hairstyles, different clothes, but they were unmistakably her, and in the corner of each canvas there was a signature, RD, followed by dates that went from several years ago to just a few months back. But it was when she saw the canvas covered by a sheet in the center of the room that her world collapsed. With trembling hands, she pulled the fabric. It was her, wearing an elegant black gala dress, her hair up in a sophisticated hairstyle, her eyes precisely lined. She was in an environment that seemed familiar, an elegant party with people in the background wearing Venetian masks, and in the lower right corner, the signature RD 2020, 4 years ago. Richard had said he had met her only 2 days ago, but that painting proved it was a lie. "You shouldn't be here." She turned, startled. Richard was at the door, still wearing the clothes from the night before, but with an expression she had never seen, cold, calculating, dangerous. "You know me," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "For years, all this time, you've been lying." He entered the room, closing the door behind him. When he approached, she instinctively backed away. "Not exactly lying," he said calmly, "just omitting certain truths." "What truths?" Richard stopped in front of the uncovered canvas, observing his own work with a melancholy expression. "Do you really want to know?" he asked. "Because once you know, there will be no going back." She looked at all those portraits, at the incontestable evidence of an obsession that had lasted years, and realized she had no choice. "I want to know everything," she said. Richard smiled, but there was no joy in that smile. It was the smile of a man who could finally stop pretending. "Then sit down," he said, indicating an armchair in the corner of the room. "This is going to be a long conversation." Richard walked to one of the windows of the studio and opened it, letting the fresh morning air enter the room charged with paint and secrets. He remained with his back to her for long minutes, observing the gardens outside as if organizing his thoughts. She remained seated in the armchair, her heart beating so hard that she was sure he could hear it. "Your real name is Emily," he said finally, without turning. "Emily Sullivan. You were born in Countsville, daughter of a steel mill worker and a seamstress. You lost your parents at 17 in a bus accident and went to live with an aunt in Horizon City." His words echoed in the room like gunshots. "Emily?" The name resonated in her mind like a distant echo, familiar but at the same time strange. She tried to remember the aunt, the parents, anything that would connect that story to her reality, but there was only a frustrating void. "Continue," she said, her voice coming out hoarser than intended. Richard turned slowly, leaning on the windowsill. There was a tension in his shoulders that suggested the conversation would be as difficult for him as for her. You were intelligent, ambitious. You got a scholarship to study business at Pacific University. You worked part-time at an art gallery in the city center to support yourself. That's where we met 5 years ago. At an art gallery, she repeated, trying to force some memory. I was buying a painting for my mother. She always loved art before the illness. You attended to me. You were wearing a simple blue dress, had your hair tied up with a pencil, and when you smiled... He paused, lost in the memory. When you smiled, it was as if the whole world had stopped. Despite all the tension, she felt her heart accelerate at the way he spoke about that first meeting. There was a genuine adoration in his voice that contrasted with the sinister environment of the studio. I started frequenting the gallery regularly, continued Richard. I made up excuses to see you. I bought works I didn't need, asked about, artists I wasn't interested in. You must have found it strange, a man of my age and social position being so interested in a university student. And I returned your interest. At first, no. You were cautious, suspicious. You knew that men like me usually don't have serious intentions with women like you, but I was persistent. His smile was melancholy, perhaps too persistent. She stood up from the armchair and walked to one of the smaller canvases, a portrait of her laughing, with her hair loose in the wind. The technique was impressive, each detail captured with obsessive love. How long did our relationship last? 2 years, he answered immediately, like someone who had counted the days. 2 of the most intense years of my life. You moved here after 6 months. You finished your studies, got a job in the town office. It seemed like we had found our place in the world. So what went wrong? Richard remained quiet for so long that she began to wonder if he would answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was loaded with guilt. I introduced you to a world that perhaps should have remained closed to you, he said. My family. We have connections that go beyond conventional business. There's a social circle, a group of influential people who meet regularly. Politicians, businessmen, judges, people with a lot of power and few scruples. What kind of meetings? Parties, dinners, social gatherings. On the surface, normal high society events. But there were other elements. Rituals, power games, situations that tested moral and ethical limits. He ran his hand through his hair, visibly uncomfortable. They were people addicted to power, to control, to breaking rules without consequences. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. Fragments of images began to appear in her mind. Low lights, loud music, faces covered by masks. The masquerade, parties, she murmured. Richard looked at her sharply. You're starting to remember. Just fragments, images without context. She approached him, studying his expression. Why did you take me to that world? Because I was young and stupid, he said bitterly. Because I wanted to impress you, show that you belonged to my world. Because I thought that if you knew all aspects of my life, you would love me completely. He laughed without humor. It was the biggest mistake I ever made. What happened at those parties? Richard moved away from the window and walked to the center of the room, stopping in front of the canvas that showed her in the black gala dress. The first time I took you, you were fascinated. It was a completely different world from yours. Luxury, sophistication, powerful people treating you as an equal. You adapted quickly, perhaps too quickly, and you became jealous? It wasn't jealousy, he said, lightly touching the frame of the canvas. It was fear. You started to change, to become interested in the power games, in the intrigues, and I realized I was losing you to that world. Emily approached him, trying to see beyond the words. There was something more, wasn't there? Something you're not telling me. Richard turned to her, and for the first time since he had entered the studio, she saw genuine vulnerability in his eyes. There was a man, he said softly, someone powerful, charismatic, dangerous. He became interested in you and you returned his interest. The revelation hit her like a punch to the stomach. I betrayed you. You fell in love with him, said Richard, and each word seemed to hurt physically. Or thought you had. He fallen in love. He had a way of manipulating people, of making them believe it was love, when in reality, it was just control. Who was he? Marcus Vaughan. Senator, businessman, one of the most influential men in the country. Married with children, but that was never an obstacle for him. He collected young, beautiful women like trophies. Richard's voice was loaded with hatred, and you were the most desired trophy he had ever found. Emily sat heavily on the edge of a table covered with brushes. The information came like waves, each more disturbing than the last. And I ended things with you because of him. Not exactly. You tried to have both. You thought you could manage the situation, maintain our relationship, while exploring what Vaughan offered. Richard laughed bitterly. But men like him don't share, and I couldn't accept it. What did you do? I made mistakes, he admitted. I tried to force you to choose. I blackmailed, manipulated, used my own resources to try to keep you away from him. But the more I pressured, the more you rebelled. Emily stood up and walked to another canvas. This one showed her crying, with disheveled hair and an expression of despair. And then you disappeared. The words hung in the air like a sentence. Emily turned to face him, trying to process what she had just heard. What do you mean, I disappeared? On a December night 4 years ago, there was a special party, a year-end celebration in the basement of the mansion. You came accompanied by Vaughan, wearing that black dress. He pointed to the canvas. You seemed happy, intimate. I was destroyed, seeing you in his arms. Continue. During the party, there was an argument. Someone had discovered something about Vaughan's business, something that could destroy his career. He became furious, paranoid, started accusing people of betrayal. Richard ran his hand over his face, visibly disturbed by the memory. You tried to calm him down, but he pushed you, humiliated you in front of everyone. And then you ran out. You went up from the basement, crossed the house, went out through the gardens. I tried to follow you, but when I reached the main gate, you had already disappeared into the forest. Emily felt her legs weaken. And no one ever saw me again? We searched all night. Me, my men, even some of the party guests. But the forest is dense. There are ravines, rivers. When the sun rose, there was just nothing. And you called the police? Richard hesitated. We couldn't. The nature of the party, the people who were present, calling the authorities would have exposed everyone. Vaughan had a lot to lose, as did the others. So you just gave up? I never gave up, he said fiercely. I hired private detectives, offered rewards, investigated every lead no matter how small, but it was as if you had simply evaporated. Emily walked to the window, trying to organize her thoughts. Outside, the gardens seemed peaceful and normal, but now she knew they hid dark secrets. And then, 4 years later, you find me on a secondary road, without memory, as if I had come out of nowhere. Yes. And you thought it was just coincidence? Richard laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Coincidence would be the last thing I would think. Someone wanted you to be found. The question is who and why. Emily turned to him, a new understanding dawning in her eyes. You think someone kept me hidden all these years? It's the only logical explanation. You haven't aged, haven't changed. It's as if you had been preserved. The word preserved made her shudder. Preserved for what? That's the question that keeps me awake every night. They remained silent, each lost in their own thoughts. Then Emily remembered something. Richard, the first night I spent here, you said, "Welcome back." Why? He looked at her with an almost guilty expression. Because in a way you really were coming back home. This house was yours for 2 years. You know every corner, every corridor, every secret these walls guard. Then why don't I feel at home? Why does everything seem familiar, but at the same time strange? Because you're not the same person who left, he said simply. 4 years missing, memories erased. Whatever happened to you, it changed who you are at the most fundamental level. Emily walked to a smaller canvas, hidden behind the others. When she pulled it forward, she saw herself portrayed in a way that made her blush, nude, in an intimate pose, clearly painted from memory. You loved me, she said, touching the frame. Love, he corrected. Present, not past. I never stopped loving you, Emily, not for a second in all these years. The intensity in his voice made her turn to him. There were tears in his green eyes, and she realized that this powerful and controlled man was completely vulnerable before her. But you're also afraid of me, she observed. I can see it in your eyes. I am, he admitted, afraid that you'll remember everything and decide that you hate me, afraid that whoever kept you hidden will come looking for you, afraid of losing you again. Emily approached him, studying every line of his face. And if I said I want to remember everything, that I need to know the whole truth, no matter how painful it is? Then I would help you, he said without hesitation, even if it meant losing you in the end. How? Richard walked to a table in the corner of the room and opened a drawer. From inside, he took an old and ornate key. With this, he said, extending the key to her. What is it? The key to the basement, to the place where everything started. To go wrong. Emily took the key, feeling the cold metal in her hands. You want me to go there? I want you to decide. If you want answers, they're down there. But once we go down, together, there will be no turning back. You'll see things that may forever change how you see me, how you see yourself. And if I decide not to go, then we'll live as we are living now. I will take care of you, protect you, and perhaps with time, we can build something new on the ashes of the past. Emily looked at the key, then at Richard, then at all the canvases that showed different versions of herself. It was a choice between safe ignorance and dangerous truth. When can we go down? Now, if you want, or never, the choice is yours. Emily closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and when she opened them again, there was an iron determination in her gaze. I want to go now. Richard nodded, as if he had already expected that answer. Then let's go. But first, he approached her and touched her face with a gentleness that contrasted with the tension of the moment. No matter what we discover down there, I want you to know that the last 3 days have been the happiest I've had in 4 years. Richard. And I want you to know that if I could go back in time, I would do everything differently. I would protect you from me, from my world, from all the choices that hurt you. Emily leaned in and kissed him softly. Maybe it's too late to change the past, she said against his lips. But we can still choose the future. They left the studio together, Richard carefully locking the door behind them. They went down to the first floor, passed through the library, the living room, until they came to a discreet door hidden behind a bookshelf. Richard activated a hidden mechanism, and the bookshelf rotated, revealing a stone staircase that descended into darkness. The air that rose from below was laden with moisture and a sweet perfume that she couldn't identify. "Last chance to change your mind," said Richard, turning on a flashlight. "I'm not going to change it," she answered, taking his hand, and they descended together, their steps echoing off the stone walls. The staircase was long, spiral, clearly very old. The walls were decorated with symbols that Emily didn't recognize, but that made something in her chest tighten with anxiety. When they finally reached the bottom, Richard opened a heavy wooden door, and Emily found herself in an underground hall that took her breath away. It was enormous, with a vaulted ceiling supported by marble columns. The floor was covered with intricate mosaics that formed hypnotic designs. There was a bar in the corner, leather armchairs arranged in intimate circles, and a small stage at one end. But what most caught attention were the masks, hundreds of them hanging on the walls, each more elaborate than the last. "My God," murmured Emily. "Is this where you held the parties?" "Yes," answered Richard, carefully observing her reaction. "This hall has existed for more than 100 years. My great-grandfather built it for private entertainment, but over time, it evolved into something different." Emily walked through the hall, touching the masks, feeling a disturbing familiarity with the environment. "I was here many times, wasn't I? At least a dozen times in the last months before you disappeared. And I liked it?" Richard hesitated. "At first, yes. You were fascinated by the luxury, by the power of the people who frequented this place. But later," he paused, "later you began to realize that not everything was glamour." "What do you mean?" "The parties here weren't just social, Emily. They were transactional. Political favors being negotiated, shady deals being closed, moral boundaries being tested and broken." Emily approached the stage, and suddenly an image flashed through her mind. Herself standing there, wearing the black dress, while masked men observed her like predators studying prey. "I performed here," she said, her voice coming out as a whisper. "Sometimes," Richard admitted reluctantly. "Vaughn liked to exhibit you, and you seem to enjoy the attention." "What kind of performances?" "Dance, mainly. You were always graceful, sensual, but there were other things too." He stopped, clearly uncomfortable. "What other things, Richard?" "Games, competitions, situations where you were the prize to be won." Nausea rose in her throat. "And you allowed this?" "I tried to prevent it," he said defensively, "but you were changed, addicted to the adrenaline, to the power you felt from being desired by such influential men. And Vaughn encouraged you, convinced you that you were in control, when in reality I was just an object for their entertainment." "Yes." Emily moved away from him, walking to one of the walls where there were framed photographs. They were images of the parties, elegant people wearing masks, talking, laughing, drinking. But when she looked closer, she saw things that made her back away horrified. In some photos, there were young women in clearly compromising situations. In others, powerful men that she recognized from newspapers and television doing things that would destroy their careers if they were made public. "Richard," she said, her voice trembling, "these photographs, they're insurance," he explained. "Everyone who frequents this place knows they're being documented. It's a way to ensure mutual loyalty." "Blackmail." "Mutual protection," he corrected. "No one can expose anyone without exposing themselves too." Emily continued looking at the photographs, and then she saw one that paralyzed her. It was her, clearly intoxicated or drugged, being supported by two men she couldn't recognize. Her dress was torn, her hair disheveled, and there was an expression of terror in her eyes. "Richard," she said, pointing to the photo, "when was this taken?" He approached, looked at the image, and his face paled. "At the last party you attended," he said softly. on the night you disappeared. Who are these men? I don't know, he admitted. There were many guests that night, some I didn't know. Vaughan brought people from outside, from other circles. Emily studied the photo more closely. Richard, look at my eyes in this photo. Don't you see? He looked closer, and she saw the exact moment when he realized the same thing she had. You weren't just intoxicated, he said slowly. You were drugged, heavily. And what if I wasn't participating voluntarily in that party? The implication of the question hung in the air between them. Richard moved away from the wall, running, his hands through his hair. If you weren't there by your own will, he began, but couldn't finish the sentence. Then maybe I didn't run away that night, Emily completed. Maybe I was taken. Richard turned to her, and there was a fury in his eyes that she had never seen before. If someone hurt you, he said, in a dangerously low voice, if someone forced you to do anything against your will, I will find them, and I will destroy them. But how will we discover the truth? 4 years have passed. Richard walked to the bar and opened a cabinet hidden behind the bottles. From inside, he took a metal box. With this, he said, placing the box on the table. What is it? Security recordings. All the parties were filmed for obvious reasons. I kept the tapes from the last night, even after everyone else destroyed them. Emily looked at the box as if it were a bomb about to explode. You mean we have the recordings of everything that happened that night? Yes. But Emily, he held her hands. Once we watch these tapes, we can no longer pretend we don't. No, whatever we discover, it will change everything between us. Emily looked into his eyes, seeing the love, the fear, the guilt, and the determination mixed in an expression that broke her heart. Then let's find out, she said. I want to know who I really was, and who did this to me. Richard nodded and opened the box. Inside, there were several videotapes labeled with dates. He took the last one, dated December 20th, 2020. Are you sure? He asked one last time. I'm sure. He inserted the tape into an old device in the corner of the room, and the screen came to life. Emily prepared herself to finally discover the truth about what had happened on the night that changed everything. But nothing could have prepared her for what she was about to see. The screen flickered a few times before gaining clarity, showing the underground hall exactly as it was now, but decorated for a party. There were at least 50 people, all wearing elaborate masks, dressed in elegant attire. The music was loud, sensual, and the atmosphere was heavy with cigar smoke and expensive perfumes. Emily held Richard's hand as they watched, her heart beating so hard it seemed to echo off the stone walls. On the screen, she could see herself, or rather, the Emily of 4 years ago, dancing in the center of the hall. She wore the black dress from the painting, her hair loose, cascading over her shoulders, and she moved with a sensuality that bordered on hypnotic. My God, she murmured, I really looked different. You were different, said Richard, his voice tense. In the last weeks before the disappearance, it was as if you were another person, more daring, more reckless. Now, I understand why. In the recording, Emily was clearly under the influence of some substance. Her movements were too fluid, her expression too relaxed, her eyes slightly unfocused. Masked men surrounded her, offering drinks, touching her with a familiarity that made Richard clench his fists. Who's that? Asked Emily, pointing to a tall man with a golden mask who seemed to be coordinating the party. Marcus Vaughan, Richard answered through clenched teeth. On the screen, Vaughan approached the dancing Emily and pulled her close, whispering something in her ear that made her laugh. But when the camera focused better, Emily could see that the laughter was forced, almost hysterical. I was Trying to appear happy, she realized, but I was terrified. The recording continued, showing the party progressing. Gradually, Emily noticed that fewer people remained in the hall, and those who stayed seemed to be preparing for something special. The lights were dimmed, more somber music began to play, and someone brought an ornate armchair that was placed in the center of the space. "What's happening?" asked Emily, though she already feared the answer. "It's when the special games began," said Richard, his voice laden with disgust. "I always left before this part. I couldn't stay to watch. But I stayed. Vaughn wouldn't let you leave." On the screen, the Emily of the past was led to the central armchair. She was visibly more altered now, stumbling slightly, needing support to remain standing. The remaining men formed a circle around her, and present-day Emily realized with horror that she recognized some of the faces behind the masks. Famous politicians, well-known businessmen, even a popular television host. "They were using me as entertainment," she said, her voice coming out as a horrified whisper. "Worse than that," said Richard, "they were using you as currency." In the recording, Vaughn approached the armchair and began to speak, though the audio wasn't clear enough to understand the words. But his body language was clear. He was auctioning something, and what was being auctioned was Emily. "No," murmured Emily, bringing her hand to her mouth. "They can't be selling a night with you to whoever gave the highest bid," completed Richard, his voice trembling with anger. "Vaughn was using you to gain political favors, business deals, privileged information." On the screen, the bidding was getting more heated. Men raised their hands, made discreet signals, and Vaughn noted everything in a small notebook. Throughout the process, Emily remained seated in the armchair, clearly without full awareness of what was happening. Then something changed. The Emily in the recording began to stir, trying to get up from the armchair. Her movements were uncoordinated, but there was an urgency in them that suggested part of her consciousness was returning. "I was beginning to realize what was happening," said present-day Emily, watching her past version struggle against the effects of the drug. On the screen, Vaughn approached the armchair and held the shoulders of the altered Emily, clearly trying to calm her. But she pulled away from him violently, almost falling off the chair. It was then that she looked directly at one of the cameras, and present-day Emily saw the exact moment when consciousness returned to her own eyes. "I remember," whispered Emily, tears beginning to stream down her face. "My God, I remember that moment." In the recording, the Emily of the past stood up, stumbling from the armchair, and began to scream. Although the audio was distorted, it was possible to understand words like "no" and "stop." The masked men backed away, clearly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding. Vaughn tried to approach again, but Emily pushed him with surprising strength for someone under the influence of drugs. Then she ran off, stumbling slightly but determined to escape. "This is where you ran into the forest," said Richard. "No," answered Emily, her eyes fixed on the screen. "Wait, look." In the recording, the camera had followed Emily to the stairway, but then changed angle. Now it showed another entrance to the basement, one that Emily didn't know existed. Through this entrance, two men entered silently. They weren't wearing masks and didn't seem to be part of the party. "Who are they?" asked Emily. Richard leaned closer to the screen, studying the faces. His face gradually paled. "It can't be," he murmured. "What is it? Do you know them?" The taller one is Dr. Marcus Fisher, a renowned psychiatrist, specialist in experimental memory treatments. Richard paused, processing the implications. "And the other?" "And the other is Dr. Paul Morgan, the doctor I was going to call to examine you." Emily felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. "The doctors you trust were there that night?" "They weren't at the party," said Richard slowly, thinking aloud. "They arrived afterward, during the chaos, as if they were waiting." In the recording, the two doctors quickly went up the stairs, clearly knowing exactly where they were going. The camera lost focus on them for a few minutes, but then changed to an external angle that showed the mansion's gardens. There was Emily, running barefoot across the grass, clearly disoriented but trying to get away from the house. She had almost reached the gate when the two doctors appeared from the shadows, blocking her path. "They were waiting for me," realized Emily. "They knew I would try to escape." On the screen, Emily tried to go around the men, but Dr. Fisher grabbed her by the arm. There was a brief struggle, and then Dr. Morgan took a syringe from his pocket. Emily screamed, but the sound was muffled by the distance and the effects of the night recording. "They drugged me," said Emily, watching her past self collapse in the doctor's arms. "They took me." Richard stood up abruptly from his chair, walking to the wall and hitting it forcefully with his fist. "Son of a bitch," he shouted. "I trusted them. For 4 years I trusted Dr. Morgan to help find you." "Richard," said Emily, a new understanding dawning in her voice, "if they took me that night, and Dr. Fisher is a memory specialist." "They erased your memories," he completed, turning to her with an expression of absolute fury. "They kept you sedated, controlled, somewhere they could experiment with your mind. But why? Why do this to me?" Richard returned to the screen, rewinding the recording to the moment when Emily was screaming during the auction. "Because you saw too much," he said. "Heard too much. You could destroy all these people if you talked about what happened here. So, they turned me into a blank page. And when they finally decided it was safe to release you, they put you on that road where they knew I would pass." Richard turned to her, his features hardened by anger. "They used me, Emily. They knew I still loved you, that I would take care of you, that I wouldn't ask difficult questions if you had no memories." Emily stood up, walking to one of the masks hanging on the wall. "But something went wrong with their plan," she said. "Otherwise, why would you have these recordings? Why didn't they destroy them?" "Because I hid them before they knew they existed," answered Richard. "And because—" he hesitated. "Because what?" "Because I suspected Dr. Morgan wasn't being completely honest with me. 6 months ago, he started asking strange questions about you, about my feelings, about whether I would be able to take care of someone who didn't remember the past. He was testing the waters. And I, like an idiot, thought he was being kind, preparing me for the possibility that you would never be found." Emily turned to him, a new determination in her eyes. "Richard, where is Dr. Fisher's clinic?" "About an hour from here. Why?" "Because if they kept me somewhere for 4 years, there might still be evidence, other victims, documents that prove what they did." Richard shook his head. "It's too dangerous if they realized you're recovering your memory. Then let's end this before they realize." Emily approached him, taking his hands. "Richard, for 4 years you've lived blaming yourself for losing. Now we know the truth. It wasn't our choices that separated us. It was a conspiracy. But Emily, no buts. I want my life back, I want my memories back, and I want these men to pay for what they did." Richard studied her for long moments, seeing the determination in her eyes. "Are you sure? Once we start this, there will be no turning back." "I'm absolutely sure." He nodded slowly. "Then we'll need help. I know people, private investigators who work outside the official system." "How long will it take?" "If we act quickly, we can be at the clinic tonight." Emily headed for the stairs. "Then let's get ready." "Wait," said Richard, holding her arm. "There's something else you need to know before we leave here." "What?" He walked to the bar and opened another secret compartment. From inside, he took out a yellowed envelope. "I found this in your room the morning after you disappeared. It was hidden inside the lining of your dress." Emily took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside there was a paper with her own handwriting, but shaky, hurried. "If he says you're safe, run. It's the last thing you'll hear before you disappear. Don't trust the doctors. Don't trust anyone but Richard. They will erase everything, but maybe this will be enough to remind you of who you really are. Emily Sullivan, December 20th, 2020. I love you, Richard. I've always loved you." Tears flowed freely down Emily's face as she read and reread the note. "I wrote this," she whispered. "Even drugged, even confused, I knew something was wrong." "You left clues," said Richard, his voice broken with emotion. "Even in the midst of chaos, you were trying to protect yourself. And trying to protect you too." Emily looked at him through her tears. "I loved you, Richard. The note says so." "And I love you," he answered, pulling her into his arms. "I never stopped loving you, not for a second." They kissed there in the basement, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, but finally united by the truth. When they separated, Emily had a new clarity in her eyes. "Let's end this," she said. "Today." 2 hours later, they were in a dark van parked in front of the Fisher Clinic, a private and isolated facility in the mountains. Richard had called. 3 private investigators, former police officers who worked discreetly for people with resources and a need for confidentiality. "The security recordings show minimal activity," said Carlos, the leader of the group. "Just 2 cars in the parking lot, probably the night staff." "And Dr. Fisher?" asked Emily. "Left an hour ago, heading for Horizon City. Shouldn't be back until tomorrow." Richard checked his gun. He had insisted on being armed, despite Emily's protests. "What's the plan?" "Simple and direct," said Carlos. "Marcus will disable the security system. Luis stays in the van, monitoring communications. You, me, and Emily go in, look for evidence, get out. And if we encounter resistance, we improvise." They moved silently through the clinic's gardens. The building was modern, all glass and steel, contrasting with the dense vegetation around it. Marcus worked quickly on the security panel, and in a few minutes they were inside. The interior was immaculate, with white corridors and the smell of disinfectant. It looked like a normal clinic, but Emily felt something familiar in the environment, a primitive fear she couldn't explain. "Where to?" whispered Richard. "Let's look for Dr. Fisher's files first," answered Carlos. "Then the laboratories." They found the office on the 2nd floor. Carlos worked on the lock while Emily and Richard kept watch. When the door opened, they were faced with a luxurious environment. Mahogany desk, shelves full of medical books, diplomas hanging on the walls. But it was when Carlos opened the file cabinet that they found what they were looking for. "My God," he murmured, leafing through documents. "Emily, you need to see this." There was an entire folder with the name Emily Sullivan, Project Tabula Rasa. Inside, detailed documents about experimental memory erasure procedures, progress reports, and photographs of her unconscious in a hospital bed. "Project Tabula Rasa," read Emily, her voice trembling. "Blank page." Richard picked up another document. "Look at this. There are other names here, other women." It was true. There were at least a dozen similar folders, all with female names, all with the same type of documentation. "They did this to other people," said Emily, feeling nauseous. "How many women have they destroyed?" "And look at this," said Carlos, pointing to a document with an official letterhead. "These experiments were funded by the federal government. There are signatures of senators, ministers." "Marcus Vaughan," said Richard, recognizing one of the signatures. "He wasn't just using you for entertainment. You were part of a government experiment." Emily sat heavily in a chair, processing the information. They used me as a guinea pig. But there's good news, said Carlos, continuing to read. According to these documents, the memory erasure process is reversible. There are detailed protocols here about how to restore suppressed memories. Where? Asked Emily, standing up immediately. In the basement laboratory. And according to this, there are other patients still being kept there. Richard and Emily looked at each other. Let's go down, he said. The basement of the clinic was completely different from the upper floors. It looked like a laboratory from a science fiction movie. Sophisticated medical equipment, advanced computers, and a row of rooms with glass windows. And in 3 of those rooms, there were women lying in hospital beds, connected to machines, clearly sedated. My God, whispered Emily, approaching one of the windows. They're alive. Richard checked the charts hanging outside each room. Maria Wilson, 28 years old, missing for 2 years. Carla Santos, 25 years old, missing for 3 years. Ana Oliveira, 30 years old, missing for 5 years. 5 years? Repeated Emily, horrified. They've kept these women sedated for 5 years. Carlos was examining the equipment. According to the monitors, they're all in an induced vegetative state, but the vital signs are stable. Can we wake them up? Not without proper medical supervision. It would be too dangerous. Emily turned to Richard, determination burning in her eyes. Then let's get medical supervision. Let's make all of this public. Let's destroy these monsters. Emily is right, said Carlos. But first we need to get out of here with the evidence. I've photographed everything, but... He was interrupted by Luis's voice through the radio. Guys, we have a problem. 2 cars approaching fast. They look official. Damn, said Carlos. Someone must have triggered a silent alarm. Emergency exit? Asked Richard. Blocked by construction, according to the plans. Emily looked at the women in the rooms, then at the documents in her hands. We won't be able to save everyone today, she said, but we can ensure that the truth comes out. She went to one of the computers and started typing quickly. I'm sending everything to journalists, federal authorities, human rights organizations, multiple copies to multiple recipients. Good idea, said Carlos, but we need to leave. Now. They ran to the stairway, but when they reached the ground floor, they heard voices in the main corridor. They were surrounded. This way, whispered Richard, indicating a side exit he had noticed on the way in. They managed to reach the garden without being seen, but when they approached the van, they saw it was being surrounded by armed men. Luis, Carlos called over the radio. Silence. They got him, said Richard. Emily clutched his arm. Richard, what are we going to do? Before he could answer, a familiar voice echoed in the darkness. Emily, my dear, it's good to see you again. They turned. Dr. Marcus Vaughan was standing a few meters away, accompanied by Dr. Morgan and several armed men. Even in the dark, Emily could see the cruel smile on his face. Senator Vaughan, said Richard, placing himself protectively in front of Emily, what a surprise to find you here. I don't believe it's a surprise, answered Vaughan. You were always too smart for your own good, Richard, just like our dear Emily. What do you want? Asked Emily, trying to keep her voice steady. We want to fix a mistake, said Dr. Morgan, approaching with a syringe in his hand. The treatment you received was incomplete. Some memory fragments escaped the cleaning process. You can't. Oh, do this, said Richard. The evidence has already been sent. Even if you do something to us, the truth will get out. Vaughan laughed. Oh, Richard, do you really think we don't have control over the media, over the authorities? This operation has protection at the highest levels of government. People will look for us. And they'll find a very convincing story about a couple who decided to run away together to start a new life, said Vaughan. Very romantic, actually. Dr. Morgan approached further, but Emily backed away. No, she said, her voice gaining strength. You won't do this to me again. Emily, said Vaughan with false gentleness, you don't understand. What we did to you was a gift. We erased all the painful memories, all the trauma. You can be happy now. Happy? Shouted Emily. You stole 4 years of my life. You stole my identity, my memories, my humanity. And now we're going to give you the chance to start again, said Dr. Morgan. This procedure will be definitive. You won't remember any of this by morning. No, said Richard, pulling Emily behind him. You'll have to kill me first. If necessary, said Vaughan casually, signaling to the armed men. But before they could act, bright lights illuminated the entire garden. Sirens began to sound, and several federal police vehicles surrounded the clinic. Dr. Marcus Vaughan, echoed a voice through a megaphone. You are under arrest for crimes against humanity, kidnapping, and human trafficking. Vaughan and Dr. Morgan looked at each other, confused. How? Began Vaughan. Because, said Emily, smiling for the first time in days, I didn't just send the evidence to journalists. I sent it directly to Operation Justice, and apparently they've been investigating you for months. The next few minutes were chaos of arrests, rights being read, and evidence being collected. Richard and Emily remained embraced, watching their torturers being taken away. 3 months later, Emily was sitting in the office of a psychiatrist specializing in recovering traumatic memories in New York. Dr. Helena Carter was a kind 50-year-old woman who had been recommended by the federal police. How are you feeling? Asked Dr. Carter. Better, answered Emily. The hypnotherapy sessions are working. Each week I recover more memories. And what do you remember about Richard? Emily smiled. I remember falling in love with him. I remember the happiness I felt when we moved into the mansion together. I remember how he loved me, how he protected me. Her expression darkened slightly. And I remember how my ambition almost destroyed everything. Ambition is not a defect, Emily. You were manipulated by powerful people who took advantage of your dreams. I know that now. But at the time, Emily shook her head. I thought I could use that world as much as it used me. I was wrong. And Richard, how are you two doing? Emily's smile widened. We're good. Better than good. We're rebuilding our relationship on a foundation of complete honesty. No secrets, no lies. And the plans for the future? Day, we're selling the mansion. There are too many bad memories associated with it. We're moving to a smaller, simpler house near Horizon City. Richard is restructuring his businesses, moving away from anything that has a connection to that corrupt world. And you? I'm studying law. I want to specialize in victims' rights, help other women who went through what I did. Dr. Carter nodded approvingly. And the other victims from the clinic? Maria, Carla, and Anna are recovering well. It's a long process, but they're all responding to treatment. We formed a support group. Emily paused. It's strange, but in a way, our shared experience gave us a family we never had. That's very positive. And the nightmares. They've decreased a lot. Richard has been wonderful, very patient. Some nights I still wake up frightened, but he's always there. When Emily left the office, Richard was waiting for her in the car. He had changed too, less formal, more relaxed. He wore a simple shirt and jeans, and there was something in his smile that she hadn't seen in years. How was it? He asked, kissing her softly. Good. Dr. Carter thinks that in a few more months, I'll have recovered almost all my memories. And how do you feel about that? Emily considered the question. happy. Even knowing that some memories will be painful, I want them all back. They're part of who I am. They drove in silence for a few minutes, enjoying the scenery of the mountains. It was autumn, and the trees were golden. "Richard," Emily said finally. "Yes? Do you regret anything?" He thought for a moment. "I regret having taken you into that world. I regret not having fought harder for you before Vaughn manipulated you. I regret not realizing what the doctors were doing. But I don't regret loving you. And I don't regret having gone through all this if it meant getting you back." Emily took his hand. "I love you, Richard. What I feel for you now is even stronger than before, because it's based on truth, not on fantasies or manipulation." "I love you too," he said, bringing her hand to his lips. "Forever." 6 months later, they married in a simple ceremony in a colonial church in Golden Hill. Only close family and the friends who had supported them during the most difficult period were present. Maria, Carla, and Anna were her bridesmaids. The 4 women had become sisters through shared adversity. During their honeymoon at an isolated inn in the mountain ridge, Emily woke up one morning and realized she felt completely whole for the first time in years. Her memories had returned almost completely, but more importantly, she had found peace with her past. "Richard," she said, nestling in his arms as they watched the sunrise over the mountains. Do you think we can really start again? Leave all that behind?" "I think we already have," he answered, kissing her hair. "The moment we decided to fight together for the truth. And if I start having nightmares again, then I'll be there to remind you that you're safe, but this time you really will be." Emily smiled, remembering how those words had been used to manipulate her. Now, on Richard's lips, they had a completely different meaning. They weren't a prison, but a promise. They weren't control, but genuine love. "You're safe now," he repeated softly. And for the first time in her life, Emily completely believed those words. 2 years later, Emily graduated in law and opened an office specializing in helping victims of psychological manipulation crimes. Richard had become her partner not only in life, but also in work, using his resources to finance important cases. Marcus Vaughn was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Dr. Fisher and Dr. Morgan also received long sentences. More importantly, the investigation that began with Emily's discovery led to the dismantling of an entire network of corruption and abuse that extended across several states. On the night when the last of those involved was convicted, Emily and Richard were sitting on the porch of their new home watching the stars. Emily was 6 months pregnant, a girl they had decided to name Hope. "Do you think our daughter will ask about the past?" said Emily, caressing her belly. "When she's old enough, we'll tell her the truth," answered Richard. "Adapted for her age, of course, but she should know that her parents fought for what was right, and that true love can overcome anything, especially that." Emily leaned back against Richard's chest, feeling completely at peace. She had recovered not only her memories, but something even more precious: her identity, her strength, and her ability to love without fear. "Richard." "Yes, my love? Thank you for never giving up on me, even when I had given up on myself." "Thank you for fighting to come back to me," he answered, "and for showing me that sometimes losing everything is the only way to discover what really matters." They stayed like that until late into the night, planning the future, healing the past.